When a 68-year-old woman answered one simple question, Steve Harvey's face went pale. He set down his microphone, walked off stage, and returned with something nobody in that studio expected. 50 people. 50 former students who had traveled from across the country for one reason: to thank the teacher who changed their lives. What happened next wasn't just television. It was 40 years of silent impact, finally getting the recognition it deserved. Because sometimes the people who shape entire generations never get to see the forest they planted, one student at a time. Margaret Chen stood at the family podium on a Friday afternoon in Atlanta, her posture as straight as it had been when she stood in front of classrooms for 4 decades. At 68, she had the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. Beside her stood her daughter Linda, son-in-law Marcus, and her 2 teenage grandchildren. They'd driven from Virginia to what was supposed to be a fun family adventure. What Margaret didn't know, what she could never have guessed in her wildest dreams, was that in the studio audience sat 50 of her former students. They ranged in age from 25 to 45. They'd flown in from 12 different states: doctors, teachers, engineers, business owners, all united by one thing. They'd sat in Margaret Chen's classroom at Lincoln Elementary School, and she had changed their lives forever. Margaret had taught 3rd grade for 40 years in one of the most challenging school districts in Virginia. Lincoln Elementary served a low-income neighborhood where most children came from broken homes. Margaret had chosen to teach there, chosen to stay when other teachers transferred to easier schools, chosen to pour everything she had into children everyone else had written off. She didn't just teach reading and math. She taught her students that they mattered, that their circumstances didn't define them. She paid for school supplies out of her modest salary. She stayed after school, tutoring students. She attended their graduations. She showed up when no one else did. Margaret never made much money. She lived in a small apartment, drove a 20-year-old car, but she was rich in ways that mattered. Rich in the letters from former students. Rich in knowing she'd made a difference, even if the world never noticed. 3 months ago, David Martinez, one of her former students and now a successful attorney, saw the family feud casting call. He immediately thought of Mrs. Chen. He contacted Margaret's daughter Linda and proposed something ambitious: get Margaret on the show and organize former students to be in the audience. It took weeks of coordination, tracking down people scattered across the country, but David was determined. Mrs. Chen had given him everything. It was time to give something back. The game started normally. The Chen family played against the Rodriguez family from California. Margaret was surprisingly competitive, getting several answers on the board. Each time, there was unusually loud applause from a specific section. Margaret noticed the energy, but attributed it to general excitement. Steve Harvey noticed too, glancing toward that section, barely containing his anticipation. He knew what was coming. The game progressed through several rounds. Margaret's family was ahead by a comfortable margin. Steve was in his element, but anyone paying close attention could see he kept checking his watch, waiting for the right, perfect moment. It was the final question before Fast Money that changed everything. Steve announced it with his usual energy, though his voice carried an extra, intentional weight. Name something that gives your life meaning. Margaret's daughter Linda went first. Family, earning the number 1 answer. The family celebrated. Then it was Margaret's turn. Steve walked closer to her. Mrs. Chen, he said, using her title with deliberate respect. What gives your life meaning? Margaret didn't hesitate. Her voice was clear and strong, resonating with 4 decades of purpose. My students, the thousands of children I had the privilege to teach. The answer wasn't on the board. It didn't matter. Steve Harvey set down his card slowly. The studio fell into a curious, hushed silence. Your students, Steve repeated softly. Tell me about them. Margaret smiled, and 40 years of memories seemed to play across her face. I taught 3rd grade for 40 years at Lincoln Elementary. It wasn't an easy school. Most came from difficult circumstances, poverty, broken homes, but they were brilliant, every single one of them. They just needed someone to see it. And did you see it? Every day, Margaret said simply. I saw it in their eyes when they finally understood something. I saw it when they succeeded at something they thought was impossible. I saw it in the way they became who they were meant to be. Mrs. Chen, Steve said, his voice now taking on a powerful tone that made everyone in the studio lean forward. What if I told you that some of those students are here today? Margaret's composed expression flickered with confusion. What do you mean? Steve turned to face the audience, specifically that section that had been applauding so enthusiastically. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Margaret Chen taught for 40 years. She poured her heart into children others had given up on. And today, 50 of her former students traveled from across this country to be here, not to watch a game show, but to thank the teacher who changed everything. The studio erupted in applause and gasps. But Margaret stood frozen at the podium, her hand slowly rising to cover her mouth, tears already streaming down her face. Steve gestured to the audience section, and slowly, one by one, people began to stand. A man in his 40s wearing a business suit, a woman in her 30s in medical scrubs, a young man in his 20s in a military uniform. They kept standing. 50 people, all looking at the elderly woman on stage with expressions of pure love and gratitude. Margaret's legs trembled. Her daughter Linda rushed to her side, wrapping an arm around her mother's waist to steady her. Both of them were openly crying now. Steve walked to the first person standing, the man who had orchestrated the entire surprise. Sir, can you tell us your name and how you know Mrs. Chen? The man's voice shook with emotion. My name is David Martinez. I'm an attorney now, working in Washington, D.C. But when I was 8 years old, I was living in a homeless shelter with my mother. We'd lost everything. Mrs. Chen was my third-grade teacher. She bought me school supplies out of her own pocket. She made sure I had lunch every day. She stayed after school to help me catch up. She told me I was smart enough to be anything I wanted. Nobody had ever told me that before. Nobody. Steve moved to the next person, a woman in medical scrubs. Dr. Sarah Johnson. I'm a pediatrician at Children's Hospital in Boston. Mrs. Chen taught me that being poor didn't mean I couldn't dream big. When I told her I wanted to be a doctor, other adults laughed, but she didn't. She helped me apply for scholarships. She believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. The stories poured out, each one a testament to her silent service. There was the engineer who had been written off as having a learning disability until Mrs. Chen realized he was dyslexic. The teacher who had chosen her career solely because of Mrs. Chen's profound example. The social worker who had found the only safety she knew in the turbulent world inside Mrs. Chen's third-grade classroom. Margaret stood on that stage, tears flowing freely now. Her hands pressed to her face as if she couldn't quite process the depth of impact she was hearing. Her daughter Linda had her arms wrapped tightly around her mother, both of them sobbing. The Rodriguez family, their competitors, were crying too. Even the camera operators were wiping their eyes. Steve returned to the stage and stood before Margaret, his own eyes glistening. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the emotional weight of everyone in that studio. Mrs. Chen, what you just heard, that's only 2 people. These 50 people here represent thousands more. They're here to tell you something you need to hear, that you mattered. Those 40 years, those late nights, those dollars from your own pocket, they changed the world. One student at a time. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Steve invited all 50 former students onto the stage. They filed down from the audience, surrounding Margaret, and what happened next wasn't planned. It was pure emotion. They hugged her, one by one, then in groups, then all together. Margaret Chen disappeared into a sea of people as she'd taught decades ago. David Martinez, the attorney who'd organized this surprise, stepped forward with a microphone. His voice was thick with emotion. Mrs. Chen, we wanted to do more than just show up today. We wanted to show you the impact you had. He pulled out a folder. In this folder are 50 letters, one from each of us. Stories about how you changed our lives, plus letters from 200 more who couldn't be here. Stories about how you're the reason they graduated high school, went to college, became the professionals they are today. He handed the folder to Margaret with trembling hands. But we wanted to do something more tangible. You taught us generosity. You gave from your pocket when you had so little. So we've created the Margaret Chen Scholarship Fund. We've raised $250,000. It will provide scholarships to students at Lincoln Elementary, students from difficult circumstances, just like we were. Students who need someone to believe in them, just like you believed in us. The studio erupted in applause, but Margaret couldn't speak. She clutched the folder to her chest and wept. Steve Harvey wiped away tears. Mrs. Chen, this is living proof that teachers change the world, that one person who cares can alter the trajectory of thousands of lives. Margaret finally found her voice, though it shook. I was just doing my job. I was just teaching. These children were gifts to nurture. David Martinez shook his head firmly. No, Mrs. Chen, you weren't just doing your job. Most teachers transferred out after a year or two. You stayed 40 years. You chose us. You chose the hardest school. And you loved us. That wasn't your job. That was your calling. A younger former student, a woman who was a high school counselor, stepped forward. Her voice cracked. Mrs. Chen, when I was in your class, my father was in prison and my mother struggled with addiction. I was angry. I expected you to give up on me, but you didn't. You saw through my anger to the scared little girl underneath. I'm a high school counselor now. I work with kids just like I was. Every day, I try to be for them what you were for me. The stories continued. The military officer who'd been headed for juvenile detention until Mrs. Chen intervened. The business owner who'd been homeless and now employs 50 people. Each story was a thread in Margaret Chen's powerful tapestry of impact. Steve stepped forward. Mrs. Chen, I have one more surprise. The Family Feud producers and I are contributing an additional $50,000 to your scholarship fund, because what we've witnessed is what this show is really about. Family. And you created a family with thousands of students. He continued, I also spoke with the Virginia Department of Education. They want to name Lincoln Elementary's library after you. The Margaret Chen Learning Center. Margaret shook her head in disbelief. I don't need buildings named after me. I just wanted to teach. David Martinez smiled through his tears. We know. That's exactly why you deserve this. You never asked for it. You just showed up, day after day, and loved children who desperately needed to be loved. The Rodriguez family, their competitors, approached the stage. Mrs. Chen, we know what it's like when someone believes in you. We want to contribute to your fund too. Teachers like you change the world. Margaret spoke to everyone surrounding her on that stage. When I started teaching, I walked into that classroom and saw children who'd been told they weren't smart enough. I was angry, so I made a promise. Every child would know they mattered. Every child would know someone believed in them. Her voice grew stronger. I didn't do anything special. I just loved you. I saw you. And if that changed your life, then my life had meaning. The episode became a 2-hour special and the highest-rated Family Feud ever broadcast. The Margaret Chen Scholarship Fund grew exponentially. Within 6 months, it reached over $1 million. It now provides scholarships to 30 students per year and has expanded to other Virginia schools. Margaret retired the year after, but volunteers at Lincoln 3 days a week. Former students visit constantly, bringing their children to meet the teacher who changed their parents' lives. The Margaret Chen Learning Center opened 18 months later, and Margaret attended surrounded by hundreds of former students. David Martinez now serves on the Scholarship Fund's board. He left his high-powered firm to open a legal aid clinic in the same neighborhood. Mrs. Chen gave me a vision of who I could become. Every child deserves that. Steve Harvey keeps a photo from that day. The caption reads, "This is what 40 years of love looks like." He said Margaret Chen showed him real success is measured in lives changed. She was never rich in money, but she was the wealthiest person I've ever met. Rich in impact, rich in legacy. The Scholarship Fund now supports over 300 students annually. Many recipients are children of Mrs. Chen's original students, creating multi-generational impact. Each scholarship includes mentoring with successful professionals, many of whom are Mrs. Chen's former students, paying forward what she gave them. Margaret is 69 now, still volunteering, still seeing potential others overlook. When asked about that day, she says, "I didn't deserve all that attention. I was just teaching." But her former students know different. They know she was planting seeds that grew into forests. Share and subscribe. Because Margaret Chen spent 40 years teaching children that they mattered, and for 40 years, the world barely noticed. But on that Friday afternoon, 50 people made sure she finally understood what she'd done. Not just taught lessons, but changed destinies. Not just graded papers, but shaped futures. Not just did a job, but answered a calling that transformed thousands of lives. The answer Margaret gave that day, "My students," wasn't on any board, but it was the truest answer to what gives life meaning. Because when you spend your life investing in others, When you pour everything you have into helping people become who they were meant to be, when you love without expecting anything in return, that's when you discover what it means to live a life that truly matters. That's the lesson Mrs. Margaret Chen taught for 40 years. And that's the lesson her students will spend the rest of their lives passing forward, one person at a time, just as she taught them. Because that's what teachers do. They plant forests they'll never see. And sometimes, if they're very lucky, they get to witness just a glimpse of the shade those trees provide. Margaret Chen was that lucky. And on that day in Atlanta, she finally understood that the forest she'd planted had grown beyond anything she could have imagined.